Good morning, everyone. My name is Jerry Stegmeyer, and I'm a partner here at the IP Tech and Data Practice in Washington, D.C., working with a team of colleagues here and in our 20-plus offices on privacy, data protection, and related issues. We are delighted that all of you could join us here today for Data Privacy Day. And to have this opportunity to really focus on what it is that many of us do and spend all of our time on. And I'm not going to tell you about what Data Privacy Day is, because we really are fortunate to have David Hoffman here from Intel. And David and Intel have been instrumental in promoting Data Privacy Day around the world. So we're really fortunate to sort of hear, what it is, what it's about, and what we're trying to do through and with it. We have a really distinguished group of panelists, and I want to ensure that you all can enjoy your lunch and really hear their thoughts. So I'm not going to take much more, if any, of your time. But again, we're really grateful to have this opportunity to have you as our guests, to have our speakers and panelists, and looking forward to a really meaningful discussion today. And with that, David.
Yes.
Pardon?
Okay, thank you. Do you have a hashtag you or her use?
G-Money?
Thank you.
No, Privacy Day.
Okay.
Wonderful. And just one sort of housekeeping note. We may have some interactive discussion. We are recording things. And so in order to help facilitate that, when and if and as you speak, you'll see there are mics on every table. Green means mic is live and hot. Red means dead. And we'll try and facilitate that in terms of, calling on you and as we move through that. So with that, David, why don't you tell us a little bit about Data Privacy Day?
Thanks, Jerry. And I want to thank you for hosting this and for Reed Smith. These facilities are fantastic. It's a great place to do Data Privacy Day, and one of the law firms that has one of the leading practices in this area. This is the 11th Data Privacy Day. I'm really excited about this Data Privacy Day in particular because it was a little over 11 years ago that a person who had worked with me at Intel in Brussels gave me a call, and he said, look, there is someone coming to the US that you absolutely have to meet. There is an official who's one of our leading experts in privacy and data protection, and he's just secured a one-year fellowship at Duke University to come and to speak and to do research on a number of different technology policy areas. And so he connected Leonardo Cervera Navas and I. And after we had coffee together, Leo and his wife came over to dinner at my house. And it was over dinner that Leo had this idea and said, there's a data protection day that was just celebrated over in Europe. What would it be like if we started Data Privacy Day here in the United States? And if we not only started it, but if we focused on how to have conversations between the European Union and the United States to better appreciate actually the similarities of what we have instead of just talking about our differences. Particularly a recognition that a lot of the concepts have actually bounced back and forth between Europe and the United States and then back to Europe. And so that was the beginning of it. One of the first calls I made after, well, I should also say at that dinner, Professor Jolynn Dellinger, who teaches privacy at Duke, was at the dinner. She thought it was a great idea. Jolynn became the founding organizer for Data Privacy Day, ran all of the coordination and activities for years, went to work at the National Cybersecurity Alliance coordinating Data Privacy Day. And one of the first calls that I made is I said, look, Intel can't do this alone. We need to have a lot of other people doing this with us. One of my first calls was to Dan Caprio. And I said, Dan, who can we get at the FTC? Who can we get in other places to support this? I think this is a great idea. Dan saw it naturally right away, really got on board. And so to have those folks together 11 years later to talk about where we are with privacy and data protection and how do we continue to foster transatlantic cooperation, absolutely incredible. So thank you again for hosting, and I'll turn it over to Dan.
Perfect. Thanks. Absolutely. And by the way, Data Privacy Day is a secret that you shouldn't keep.
Yeah.
Not original to me, but someone suggested. So by all means, share and share liberally. Dan, take it away.
Well, David, thank you for your remarks. Jerry, thank you so much for hosting us. I'm Dan Caprio, co-founder of the Providence Group here in Washington, D.C., and we're delighted to partner with Reed Smith on Data Privacy Day. As David said, we began Data Privacy Day in 2008 with the idea that individuals' privacy matters and needs to be respected. From a transatlantic perspective and from a U.S. perspective, it's more important now than ever. We obviously still have a long way to go, but as we've seen over the last year, when we think about privacy, that in our individual privacy, we are more than a collection of 5,000 data points. So we have a very distinguished panel today to discuss transatlantic privacy. Let me do a quick introduction, and then we'll turn to our colleagues. To my left, we have Gail Slater. Gail's a special assistant to the president for technology, telecom, and cyber, which is a mouthful. But I've known Gail. Gail before at the White House was at the Internet Association, and before that was an attorney advisor at the Federal Trade Commission. So in her role at the White House, I mean, she works for the National Economic Council, and you can go into why that's important. And then to her left, we have, as David said, Leonardo Savara Navas. Leo's the director at the European Data Protection Supervisor, and he and David really are the fathers of Data Privacy Day. So we need to kick this off. Gail and Leo, why don't I turn to you just to kind of give kind of an overview or kind of an opening of sort of where we are, where we, today. And one of the things we want to do that's kind of different today being Data Privacy Day, and we want to talk about where we are, but we really want to try to talk about where we, and sort of learn from each other, but where we are today, but where we want to be. So let me first turn it to Gail, and then when Gail's concluded, we'll call upon Leo. So Gail.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks also to the organizers, our hosts. It's great to be here. I'm newer to Data Privacy Day than you guys, and so I want to give a shout out to everybody who's been in the room on this issue for the past 20 years, because this is potentially your Super Bowl year. And I also had a question. So we have Data Privacy Day here and Data Protection Day in Europe. And is it a tomatoes, let's call the whole thing off? Or is there a story behind that?
No, there's a story behind that, but Leo can speak to that, because in Europe, the idea that Leo imported, it was Data Protection Day.
Yeah.
And so when Leo, I'm stealing your thunder, Leo, why don't you take it?
The story goes that Dan was very kind and put me in contact with some colleagues at the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Commerce, because being an European, it would be terribly offensive if I organize something in U.S. land without the permission and the agreement of the U.S. authorities, of course. So I met with these high-level officials, and I proposed the same date, the 28th of January, which is the date of the signature of the Convention 108, which is the Data Protection Convention, and the same name. But my U.S. counterpart said, okay, we can agree with the date because it wouldn't be logical to have two different dates, but we want to call it slightly different. So let's call it Data Privacy Day. And I said, fine, provided that we do it at the same time with the same spirit. So that explains the difference in the name.
Okay, so the spirit's shared here too. I guess we want to level set and just explain a little bit where the NEC was coming on this issue back in the day. And I saw Travis just walk in. Welcome back, Travis. It's great to have the interagency colleagues back on this issue, and timely. And because Travis is going to have plenty to do in the next few weeks, I expect. But so going back in time, this is my stump speech. So if anybody's heard it before, apologies in advance. We were looking at a moment in time last May. We had GDPR coming into force. Of course, you all know about that. We had California sort of lurking out there to the West Coast, GDPR coming in from the East. And then we had, God bless him, the Zuckerberg back-to-back hearings in Congress. And so from a national economic standpoint, that he's kind of operative there, I took it upon myself, because I couldn't find anybody else in the building, to engage on this issue, because it seemed that it was a moment in time when we needed to start thinking about what good economic policy looked like in this space. And so, so there were three things that came to mind, three sort of needs that we needed to talk through, and then we kind of took it from there. And I can fast forward at some point to where we are now, but I think it's important to explain the foundation of where we were coming from. So thing number one, California. And since then, we have an emerging patchwork of state laws. Last count I heard was 15 to 20. In Washington State, I think, has something that's pretty significant that's been introduced. And the list goes on. And so that's, you don't need me to tell you, from an economic policy standpoint, that's going to lead to regulatory fragmentation. And it's even more acute where you're applying that patchwork of regulations to a technology that scales globally. So how do we scale this patchwork domestically, and is that optimal economic policy was very much to the front of mind for the group. The second thing that we talked about as an interagency when we first convened was that much of the discussion around data privacy in this country, and it may not seem intuitive, actually it will to this group because you guys are all privacy pros, was coming at us from colleagues at State Department, from ITA, within Commerce, and so it had an international dimension, right? And the international dimension is, of course, the interoperability of this country's privacy regime with privacy regimes, particularly in Europe, and we all know that story quite well. And what did the moment in time that we were in tell us about interoperability going forward? And so that was kind of thing number two. And then thing number three is we often talk about privacy policy, we talk about consumer protection policy, and we talk about them in somewhat of a silo. But at the end of the day, good privacy policy, good consumer protection policy is good economic policy. And then you had to couple that with the fact that at the moment in time, again, when we convene as an interagency, we were looking at some symptoms. I don't want to kind of go over my skis here and pronounce that there was a market failure, but there were things going on in the marketplace that were not optimal from an economic policy standpoint, and you all know what they were. And as the year progressed, those incidents seemed to increase in number. And so that pointed in the direction of doing something than nothing. And so we found ourselves in a place where we thought, no, this really is, which is not always the case in DC, this is a problem in search of a solution, right? And so we worked together as an interagency. NEC convened. We worked with White House colleagues. I never miss an opportunity to say this, so please indulge me. I am so proud of the way the Commerce Department worked together on this issue. It's, I believe, I'm told, the first time that NTIA, ITA from an international data flow standpoint, and NIST, who did such stellar work on the cyber framework back in the day, came together and pooled their privacy talent and their resources. And so coming out of the process, which was a good process, of which I am very proud. We had what's visible to you guys, which is last September, NTIA opened a docket suggesting that it's time for us to refresh our thinking on domestic data privacy policy, at least from an administration standpoint. And they issued what we think was a helpful, thoughtful, constructive request for comment. The sort of lodestar in the request for comment in overarching policy is that this administration stands behind a risk-based approach to privacy. And again, at a more even abstract level, what that means to us is we want to see an appropriate, fair balance between privacy and prosperity, as my boss, Larry Kudlow, terms it. That's the easy part. That's the easy part to pronounce what your goals are. But NTIA did open a docket, and we were very pleased that they received over 200 comments. And Travis's task, now that he's back to work, is to turn those comments around into a document that's helpful to the process going forward, which I think it's fair to say is now, the baton has now been passed to Congress, because the one thing that we heard very loud and clear from the NTIA docket is that there is a need for federal preemptive legislation, and we've said that we're happy to work with Congress in a constructive way. We think that what NTIA has done will be very helpful to that policy conversation, and to all the stakeholders who filed in the docket. And then separately but relatedly, because of the risk-based approach that we're following, we have NIST. The past is a little prologue here, working on a privacy framework similar to the cyber engineering framework that they produced 5 years ago now. And so the philosophy is aligned between what NTIA has produced and what NIST is working on. We think that from a process standpoint, it's a good process, transparent, and we want to keep iterating on these conversations. That's why I'm here, and have an open door to all stakeholders, both at NTIA as well as at NIST. But I don't speak for Congress, but I'm happy to talk about what at least I'm hearing and seeing, and the appropriate role for us in that process.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks for that opening. Leonardo, would you give us the sort of where things stand in Europe? There's obviously been a lot of news with Google and the CNIL and GDPR and the DPA conference last October. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dan. First of all, thank you very much to David Hoffman and Reed Smith and the Providence Group for organizing this event to celebrate Data Privacy Day. I would like to touch a couple of two issues. One is why data privacy, and the second, where is Europe at the moment with this subject matter, and where do we think there is opportunities for cooperation with the US? So first of all, I need to introduce my employer. Is the European Data Protection Supervisor. So in the European institutions, we have several institutions and bodies. Some of them are very, very famous to you, the European Commission, the European Parliament. Some of them are not so famous, so known, and one of them is my employer, the European Data Protection Supervisor. That is not the European Data Protection Authority, because we don't have an European Data Protection Authority yet, but it's the closest thing to European Data Protection Authority. So why data privacy? Why privacy is becoming so important nowadays as compared to 10 or 20 years ago when this subject was, I wouldn't say irrelevant, but massively unknown. Data privacy is an emanation of an older right, which is the right to privacy. And the right to privacy is a very old one. It dates back from the times of the French Revolution, actually, or even from the times of the American Revolution, which was the precursor to the French Revolution. And this right to privacy is everywhere in the world. It's not something specific from any country, because it's embedded in being human. We all need some privacy. And it is also conditio sine qua non for the exercise of other rights. If there is no privacy, you cannot exercise other important rights like the right to vote, or the right to receive or or to express yourself anonymously, something which, by the way, is at the moment under threat, because it's very difficult in the internet to be able to receive information or to express your opinions anonymously. And then, or the right to assembly, for example. When I was studying US law here at the US, I was impressed about the link between privacy legislation and all the other rights at constitutional level. So data privacy is not something new. It's actually a second generation right, coming from this general right of a right to privacy, which has become necessary in view of the advancement in the processing of personal data and the massive computing and informatics and the cheap storage of all these personal information. So it's the same thing, but now updated to the reality of new technologies. Because processing of personal data is nowadays so massive. Think of every single camera around the city, or think of all the tracking and recording of behaviors over the internet, or think of all the data being shared with our smart devices. So it's so massive and it's so deeply intrusive in our privacy and our intimacy that this is spreading, this is growing all over the world. So in Europe, we started with this 25 years ago with a directive, the famous Data Protection Directive. And 15 years later, the political class in Europe decided to update this piece of legislation that later, after 10 hard years of negotiations, it has been the most difficult negotiation ever done in the European Parliament. After 10 years of negotiations, now we have the GDPR, which is, many predicted that it would be a weakening of the data privacy right, but it was, on the contrary, a strengthening of the data privacy right, because it moved from being a commercial right to become what we call in the European Union a fundamental right, a constitutional right. So rather than being weakened, it became stronger. And I know that for some people here at the United States, you struggle about this concept of us Europeans considering data protection as a fundamental constitutional right. But for you to understand this, you need to understand what the European Union is all about. We are not a United States of Europe. We are far from being that. We don't share a language. We speak, 15 separate languages. We don't share an army. We don't share even the same currency, because some members of the European Union are not in the euro. The element for our union is different. And the element for our union is the strong belief in a series of principles, of which democracy, the rule of law are very important. The solution of conflict by peace. In Europe, we do not believe in war at all. We are totally against this. This is something really part of our DNA. And the most important thing is our EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. This is our flag, actually. We do believe that fundamental rights, human rights, unite us all as Europeans. And in this idea of these fundamental rights, there is one which is paramount, that rules all over the others, which the only one which is absolute, which is our right, the right to human dignity. So we say, Article 1 of our Constitution, human dignity is inviolable. It must be respected and protected at all times. This is our flag. This is our European Union. And how do you protect human dignity in the internet? By data protection. That's why it's so important for us, because data protection is a right that tells clearly to stakeholders how they need to behave. It's not an abstract right. It's a very concrete. It says, you can do that, you cannot do that. And then it set up independent supervisory authorities, independent from government, independent from politics. They are totally independent, that supervise that the dignity of the individuals is not undermined because of technology. This is why, for us, this data protection thing has become so important, so prevalent in our media, in our politics, and it is a different reality from yours. I totally understand that, but that explains why in Europe we take this issue so to our heart. Now, how do I see the situation in terms of transatlantic cooperation? I think data protection is no longer an European thing. Now, there is more than 150 countries around the world that have passed comprehensive data protection legislation. Because it's not, because it's pure, as I said, an emanation of the privacy right. It comes from common sense. If you want to protect the privacy of individuals, you have to have some kind of data privacy legislation. And now in America, almost all countries have data protection legislation. The last country joining the GDPR family is Brazil, as you know, the largest country in terms of population in the world with a data protection legislation. And recently Japan, they have realized that they have to move on with this data protection, and we just signed an agreement between the European Union and Japan, mutual adequacy findings among ourselves. So I think, honestly, it is about time that the United States joins the club. And it doesn't mean that it has to be done by cut and paste from the GDPR, because our realities are very different. Obviously, there are some peculiarities to this legal system, to this culture, that need to be adapted. But I think it's pretty obvious that we share the same principles and that we share the same feeling that something needs to be done. So that's why a few months ago, when we organized the International Conference of Data Protection Authorities in Brussels, Tim Cook came and he said, loud and clear, I think it's about time that we have a US federal privacy law. And the CEO of Microsoft said the same thing a few days ago. And I think there's a growing understanding that this needs to be done. And I personally think that if the US comes to the table and we make progress, this is not bad for any part, because the US has great things, great concepts. As you said, privacy and prosperity, I like that. The idea that you have to couple regulation with the need of fostering innovation, not creating unnecessary hurdles. This is very welcome. And this is something that I'm pretty sure many people in Europe will appreciate, because also our business people agree with the need of finding a good balance. So I'm personally convinced that if the US and EU come to the table, we will find a way of reaching an agreement that will be mutually beneficial. We have the same in the European Union. It is not the same, the perception of privacy we have in Spain, my country of origin, that British people have. And we have to get together and to agree on some principles, and we did. And the GDPR is a compromise. So I cannot see why we cannot fill the gap between the US and the EU. So with this, I would just like to say, again, thank you very much for hosting this event, this opportunity to talk. It's for me a real honor to be here with all of you, and in particular in the company of the Special Assistant to the President. And I reiterate my gratitude for your attention, and I'm at your disposal for questions and debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. Gail, let me come back to you, since we're on the theme of transatlantic. I know we're all very proud of the progress that we made on Privacy Shield. So the President's nomination has been sent up for the Ombudsman, which is important. That's gone remarkably well, but just an intense amount of work. We've been at this for 20 years. So from a transatlantic perspective, we should all be very proud of the progress that I think both sides have made on Privacy Shield. But to go back to where you concluded, where do we stand with Congress? I mean, so from the NEC perspective, you're talking about a risk-based approach, copying or modeling the NIST cybersecurity framework that really articulates cyber as a strategic risk and therefore privacy as a strategic risk. Where do we stand with Congress, and how do we get from here to there in terms of the end state?
So it's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. I'll share with you my observations. So where we are now at this moment in time is we have a new Congress, we have new staff, personnel is policy, right? So we have new staff both on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, but we also have a turnover in chairman in the Senate. And this is, I'd say this not just as trivia, I mean, it's really important because we need to give them time to have the dust settle on, where they are and where the respective chairmen are, and how they're going to prioritize this issue with other competing priorities in the House Energy and Commerce Committee. For example, healthcare is a big chunk of the work that they do there. So there'll be activity around drug pricing, and then there'll be time set aside for other stuff, right? And so we have to bear in mind that sort of from a temporal perspective, we need to be patient. But that doesn't mean we can't be doing good work out of NTIA and through NIST and so on that helps inform the debate. The other observation I'd make is that, so we're really focused on sort of like what we think are good, nerdy privacy outcomes here. My observation of where Congress is, so beyond the personnel, is they're thinking about the sort of big decisions that you have to make when it comes to legislation. And that's a different conversation, right? So we know from our data breach days, a lot of the conversation on the Hill versus in our circles is about preemption, right? So that's a huge issue that's going to drive the legislative outcome here. They're thinking about who's the enforcer. And I think the good news there is that all fingers are pointing in one direction, which is the Federal Trade Commission, but they're having a lot of discussions about what the appropriate role of the Federal Trade Commission is as an enforcer. Additionally, does the Federal Trade Commission need to be given rulemaking authority, which is something that always comes up in these legislative conversations and so on. And then another piece of the conversation, as I observe it, that's taking place on the Hill versus in our circles is beyond the FTC, who's in and who's out. So covered entities. That's legislative speak for what parts of the economy will be covered by this prospective legislation. And so because we do have our existing sectoral statutes in HIPAA and GLBA, and we'll call COPPA a sort of hybrid sectoral statute too, what do we do with those existing frameworks, and how would a privacy legislation for the rest of the economy impact the equities within those frameworks, right? So financial services, healthcare, and so on. And that's a part of the discussion. And that can be politically challenging, we all know, right? So those are the observations that I would make about the legislative conversation thus far. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't keep trying to inform the debate. And so, we have been up there already. We visited with the staff, and we will keep checking in with a view to providing a helpful, constructive role.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, kind of a cautionary tale, that principles are easy, legislation is hard. If it was easy, we would have had a data breach bill a decade ago. So this is a heavy lift, and especially with all the different sectoral interests. But Leo, over to you. Where do you? So we're 6 months, 7 months, I guess, into GDPR. We have the first fine by the CNIL, €50 million against Google, and so that's important from a number of reasons, because all of a sudden all the compliance issues now that the finding authority really becomes much more about emerging risk or strategic risk. But how do you see that? I mean, it seems that that case, I mean, it's about all that, and then it's also about sort of the business model for advertising or interactive advertising. How do you see the impact? So it's sort of a two-part question. I mean, the impact of the finding authority in GDPR, which everyone has been concerned about, but then the other part is, how does it affect the business model for interactive advertising?
Well, the first thing you need to understand the concept of fines in the GDPR is that it is the result of a long discussion in the European Union about the governance model we have had at the GDPR. Because if you look at the directive 25 years ago, the directive didn't have the flexibility and the business-friendly approach of the GDPR at all. Started from a very severe principle of which the most important was the data minimization. The less data you have, the better. The new framework, the GDPR, is completely different. If it's focused on the principle of accountability and the risk-based approach, which is a big deal. It's a big step forward. So it builds on the principles that companies and governments need to process personal data to conduct their business, and leaves companies the flexibility to organize their processing activities in the way they fit them better. That's a very important point. Often it is said that the European legislation is impracticable, that you cannot work with it. No, that's absolutely not true. If you look at the letter of the law is very clear. It is only applies because we recognize the processing of personal data is necessary in nowadays business reality and digital economy. Now, in order to reach to this point of flexibility, we needed to give some member states enforcement, because it's the only way to ensure a fair level field game, a playing field. Because if you don't have enforcement, who's gonna invest in privacy when you can get away without investing in privacy? So it was the only way to persuade these member states that they need to trust on flexibility, that they need to allow companies to be technologically savvy. But then they said, okay, but then give us guarantees that there will be strong enforcement. So if a company is not complying with the law, the regulator will intervene. And that's precisely what we did in GDPR, and that's precisely what is starting now with this fine for Google. So if a company takes data protection seriously, there's absolutely no problem, because the law gives the companies the flexibility to show and to demonstrate that there is compliance. The problem is for those companies which do not or are not ready to think data protection. These companies will have an issue, will have a problem, and they will get some fines. So this is something clear. It will happen. It's happening everywhere in all regulators, and there will be some fines because it is necessary for ensuring a fair, level playing field. And as to the impact on the business model, I don't think there should be any impact because, as I said, we start from the assumption that all processing of personal data is legitimate, provided that it complies with some principles and rules. Therefore, if there is a business model there that can justify the processing of some personal data, there's absolutely no problem. The problem is that after the GDPR, not everything goes. Now it's not free bar anymore. Now there is a strong piece of regulation that says clearly which are the obligations and which are the principles. And therefore, any business model need to readapt a little bit the rules to comply with these rules. But it doesn't mean that any business need to shut down, because the law is flexible enough to accommodate all kind of situations. Of course, if your processing activity is very intense risk operating, there you will have to invest more in making sure that you comply with data protection. And if your activity is less risky, then you would have to invest less. But at the end of the day, it is about investing the right resources and demonstrating compliance.
Thanks. Well, what I'd like to do, and obviously, we can sit here and talk among ourselves till the cows come home. But I'd like to get you all involved, because I see a lot of people kind of nodding and looking like you'd like to ask a question. So any questions from the audience to kick off? And if you have a question, as Jerry said, your microphone in front, push it.
Green is go, red is dead.
Right, and then identify yourself with your question. So, questions to kick off? Yes, way in the back.
Thanks. Whoa, that's loud. This is Joseph Jerome from the Center for Democracy and Technology. I have a number of questions, and thanks for a great conversation, but I guess I'll start with the preemption bugaboo. So I give a lot of credit to Intel for trying to, in their discussion draft, scope preemption, but I guess this is a question for Gail. Have you given thought as to how you might propose scoping preemption? Because certainly, some sort of broad-based field preemption is not ideal from a privacy advocate perspective, and probably not actually the intention of a privacy law in the United States. But at the same time, if you I just think preemption is really difficult. So clearly, if we're going to pass a federal law, it's going to preempt something, but what isn't it going to preempt?
So short answer, no. No, I mean, this is going to be I'd already said, I think the biggest question in this legislative conversation, so separate and apart from what we've been talking about in terms of principles and so on. I'll go back to the point that I made, which is the fragmented patchwork is not optimal, right? And so I'm at the point of saying, okay, what's good economic policy, and how should we be talking about it at this moment in time? But I hear you. I think politically it'll be very challenging with the House Democrats to talk about preempting California, at least for now. That's the sense that I get, and they've made that clear. I think another part of the conversation that's probably something that we need to start having now, and this goes back down to a panel and we recently were at where Maureen Oldhausen spoke about, again, it goes back to the role of the FTC. And so, look, if the end state here is to get to a well-informed consumer, flexibility to innovate and so on, and our European colleague has made this point already. I mean, it's the role of enforcement, right, is as important as who gets to enforce, right? And so one point that Maureen made, and I think it's an important point to make, is that there is already a partnership between the states and the FTC across many statutes, but principally in the antitrust area. State AGs routinely partner with the FTC. They apply the federal standard in antitrust investigations, and they've been doing that for years. So I recognize this might be a slight dodge to the question, but I just don't think we have enough information to say what's in and what's out and what the hard and fast position is. But I think we absolutely should be thinking about what's the goal here. We're trying to get to better, stronger enforcement. There's a role for the AGs there. Are we trying to preempt everything? I don't pretend to have the answers to that. And they're also acutely political decisions, as you know, House and Senate. And sometimes Republican senators will surprise on the issue of preemption. They won't want to see their own state preempted. And that's a conversation that will take place down the road, I'm sure.
Other questions? Jerry.
Leo, I was really impressed with your explication of sort of the history of the Union. And I find at these events there's just tremendous value because there's so much misunderstanding or frankly just ignorance between the United States and Europe and folks along the world. To pick up on Joe's question, I'm curious what, if any, role things like federalism and sovereignty come into play with all of this, and maybe, Gail or Leo, one or the other, could react. But it seems to me we're having a lot of experience right now in Europe with real discussions of sovereignty, Brexit, things going on in Spain, and yet the question of preemption here just begs precisely the same question, which is, what is the role of the states? How much do we limit it? How do we get to a dialogue on those issues, because it seems to me they ultimately will dictate, what kind of legislation we get. Do we get global harmonization on these fundamental issues? I'm just curious if either of you might react.
Indeed, there are some similarities, as you said, but the European Union project is a very sui generis thing. It's difficult to explain because I don't think you can think of any project, social, political project, which has bring more prosperity and peace in the history of humankind than the European Union. When you think of where we started in the 50s, with a continent totally destroyed by wars and the totalitarian regimes just creeping there, and then when you see where we are now, 2 or 3 generations later, because there was a group of politicians that invested on dialogue, business, because Europe, one of the things that get us together is prosperity. Yeah? That's why I like so much the reference to prosperity, and that's why the UK is agonizing in this way when leaving the European Union, because they now realize that the prosperity that the being together brings, now they're going to lose. So the European Union is really fascinated in this respect, and then the power of the member states is much higher than the power that states do have here in the States. There, in our reality, countries like Germany or France, they are super powerful. It's not like us, we are the federal government, and then they follow us. On the contrary, we need to negotiate with them all the time where we go. No? So,
California.
I don't know. I don't know the reality here, but I guess Germany is more powerful vis-a-vis the U.S. institutions than California vis-a-vis the U.S. Congress. I don't know. But what I get from all these reflections, to be honest, is that it is a moment now where we are reaching a moment of, like you said, Brexit, all the problems that you have also in the US, the big divide. It is a moment now to go back to a human-centric view of things, to put the human being in the center, and to understand, everybody to understand that in order for progress and prosperity to be a reality, we need to respect the individual, that technology needs to be sustainable, that we need to be respectful with what will happen to future generations, and we have to build from there. If we don't have these parameters clear, then things start to go wrong, and then we all pay for the consequences. So that's why, in my view, that's why I think it's really now time for the US, without prejudicing prosperity and without prejudicing innovation, without prejudicing the need to foster the economy, to look at the big risks that there are for humankind over the internet. We're talking about third parties having the capacity to hack democracy. We are talking about people not being able anymore to decide autonomously what they think and what they don't think. The people don't being receiving the information in a very biased, unfiltered way. We're talking about very important ethical issues here that I think, as a mature society, we need to confront. That's why our conference we organized in Brussels, it was not so much about data protection. Our boss, Giovanni Buttarelli, wanted to talk about ethics, because ethics talk to everybody around the world, not only to Europe. So I think on this, honestly, I see very little difference between the US and Europe. And that's why I love to come here to the US, because I learned so many things that then I try to apply in Europe, and I think it could be the other way around too.
Thanks, Leo. And I know we always feel like that when we go to Europe, that we learn a lot from each other. And I like to say we share so many common values. We agree much more than we disagree. I mean, we agree on about when it comes to privacy, probably 90%, but the focus tends to be on the 10% where we disagree. But other burning questions? Shane.
So to quote my favorite tweet from last week, who I don't know said it, they said, "Do you think that AI is biased? Wait till you meet humans." So, that's part of the challenge, I think, is that we very much in a free market economy look at this as data and what we can put forward versus, the privacy human element is not really baked into our DNA the way it is the Europeans, and understand the difference. But I do worry about future technology going forward, like AI and machine learning, which is designed to help humans, hopefully, if we design it right, and the privacy making the data sets be less informed. And so I think that's something that we're trying to struggle with when we're really looking at technology. I'm not going to go as far as my other favorite quote from last week was from a Google executive who said that we're supposed to think of data like sunshine, not oil. And I had so much fun with that in my head for like 10 minutes. I had to stop. I was like, there's okay. And so, I think that's when we look at, and the idea that the preemption is difficult. I mean, who are all these people just found out about states' rights? I mean, like we've been trying to get them on board on multiple other things. So it's fascinating to me that all of a sudden we can't preempt states. Really shocking. Okay. Look, I'm keeping a list. So I guess that's part of, what I'm looking to see where we can figure out the difference between our free market perspective on data and then the actual, human element of privacy. Do you see a big delta there? Am I the only one, or are there space to negotiate in between that? And it's hard putting some of that in legislative language here in the United States.
That's wow, that's a big question. But of course Shane would ask it. I don't know. I think maybe the way to answer it is to take a step back, and Dan, you talked about this already, is it's been really interesting going over the past year to see how greatly misunderstood, I think, and maybe it takes a new American to see the difference. The privacy regime is in this country. It's fragmented. It's not obvious. There's not one thing we can point to. There's we might say there's a fair amount of noise and not much signal in places. And so again, sometimes it takes a new American. The point in time where that really came home to me was State Department, God bless them, sent me to Brussels for the 4th of July last year. And it was a needed trip. So Commerce, State, and I went over, and it was because we were at a moment in time where we hadn't really checked in with the European colleagues in a while, and they were questioning where this administration was on this issue, and I did a little press huddle. The delegation thought it was important that we talk to journalists on the ground who cover this issue, and I just said to them, look, and again, maybe it takes a new American who's passed that quiz and had to memorize these things. That it's really important to remember that what I think, and I'll stand corrected on this, the oldest privacy norm in the world it's the Fourth Amendment, right? And again, maybe it took the New American to make that, to go into a press gaggle in Brussels and say that to a bunch of Brussels-based journalists. And we've already talked about, sort of on the commercial-facing piece of this, the FIPS are ideas that have bounced back and forth across the Atlantic for 40 years now, right? And they started at HHS here back in the day. And so this is something that I think gets overlooked. So I don't know if that's a dodge, Shane, but like that's I think something that's really important to remind ourselves of as we enter into this debate.
Leo, any thoughts about Shane's question about AI?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that concept of a free market. We also have a free market in Europe. And we also have countries like Germany that are going very well economically wise. I think we can all agree that Germany is doing super well. And they do have a strong data protection laws in place. In Germany, and it's already 10 or 15 years, there is a compulsory by law that every middle or big company has a data protection officer as in the payroll, and they are looking at these issues regularly and systematically. And I don't think you can see Germany struggling or suffering by the fact that they have had these strong data protection rules in place. So I don't think that's necessarily the equation between data protection or functioning economy. Honestly, I don't think this is the right approach. The right approach is that we have to make data protection business friendly, flexible, understanding business needs, capable of adapting to new realities like artificial intelligence, big data. And for that, I think the US have a lot of expertise. You can develop very smart solutions. And I think Europeans, we do have things to learn from the US in this respect. But at the same time, I think from our culture, from Europe, you can also take some inspiration of what means dignity and respect for the individual in the online environment. Who here in this room would accept or agree to be followed and tracked down by 50 people all the day long? I mean, would you agree to have 50 people on your neck following you and recording everything that you do and making a statistics of everything that you do? No, you would say, no, bugger off, let me alone. What are you on my neck looking at what I'm doing? But why do we accept that this is done online all the time? Doesn't make any sense. It is only because we are not told that we are watched constantly that we accept that. But once people know that this is a situation, then people say, no, please, you don't need to be so intrusive in my personal life. Please give me the choice to choose whether I want to have this part of my personality surveyed or watched or not. This has nothing to do with economy or innovation, something like that. It's just a basic principles that everybody has to interiorize and to accept in order to have business models that are a little bit more sustainable. Because the current situation, I think we all agree. You mentioned it in a very nice way when you say situation is not optimal. I think we all agree that the current situation with this data in the cloud is not sustainable. This is something that we cannot sustain. I don't want my grandchildren 70 years from now being able to find all my marketing habits on the cloud. Come on, this is not serious. We have to start taking the management of data, personal data, seriously, because it has serious implications for people. And I think on that, we, both Europeans and Americans, we agree.
Thanks, Leo. Well, we've almost come to the end of our time. Jerry, thank you again for hosting. I hope we can do this again next year, January 28th, 2020. So just as a quick closing, sort of ask for kind of a prognostication. First, Gail, and then Leo, you can have the final word. But where do you think we'll be when we meet again next year?
So that's interesting because California comes into force January 2020, and then let's see what the other states come up with. I don't want to speak for Congress. I don't speak for Congress. I don't know that it's going to happen this year, but surely we can keep doing what we've been doing in this part of the ecosystem and keep up the drumbeat. And I think that if it's not going to happen and we see that as lemons, let's make lemonade and let's keep talking about what good legislation will look like. I think it's important to remember California happened in the space of 72 hours. Right. And I'll lean on my phrase again, that's not optimal either. And I know that many people see it as a win, but I actually think, we can make the use of time. We can have a deliberative process that's longer than 72 hours, and I think that can get us to a good place.
Thanks. Leo?
Well, I think in 1 year time, there will be several enforcement actions taken by the European authorities. There will be more societal awareness about the need for some technological companies to develop a more sustainable environment. And when coming to the U.S., I'm convinced that the debate, I don't think it will be over, because it took us 10 years in the EU to find an agreement. I would be very surprised if you could do it in 10 months. But I think in 1 year from now, you will probably be more advanced in the understanding of what is your system, the model that will work for you. And if there's something we can do from our experience in the EU to help you with this process, please, you can count on us. We are doing this with many partners around the world, and we are doing it because we believe that our system cannot function on its own. I mean, everything is nowadays global. So to protect the privacy of the EU citizens, we also need the help of the US authorities. It doesn't work to do it in isolation. So it's in our own benefit to help you. If it's something we can do, please, you can count on us.
Thanks, Leo. Well, thanks everyone for your time and attention. So please join me in thanking our panel.
Thanks, everybody. There's plenty of food. You're welcome to enjoy what we have left. I wanted to just take a moment to thank our team here at Reed Smith that really took the time to help make this room available, the underlying work to put things together, and Dan and all of our folks. Let's give all of them a big round of applause. Thanks, everybody.